And we're here at the JFK exhibit. 3 shots are fired at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. And I'm joined by VOA National Correspondent Malone. Thank you so much for joining me.
You bet.
Why is JFK so important to not just America, but to the rest of the world? Set us the scene about this documentary. It talks about a pivotal moment in U.S. history. Why is it so important?
Well, Imran, I think the key is understanding John Kennedy is actually, he was killed at a very young age. He was 46, he was elected at 43, youngest president ever elected. He was struck down in the prime of life. There are all these images, some of which we see here at the Newseum, of Kennedy in his prime. His presidency was an unfinished presidency. He did accomplish things, but it's more the promise, the hope, the inspiration that Kennedy offered up. And 50 years after his death, many Americans still see that. They see Kennedy as the embodiment of that inspiration. And they'd actually like that era back because they felt there was a lot more hope and hope for the future at that time.
Okay, we're going to roll the clip and come back. This is the opening sequence of JFK, A Legacy Remembered.
John Kennedy was elected president in 1960 in one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Kennedy faced enormous challenges while in office, a tense Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union, and growing demands for civil rights at home. Kennedy's time in the White House was brief, a mere 1,000 days. But 50 years after his death, Kennedy's unique style and grace endure, and his legacy continues to be a source of both inspiration and debate.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
For those old enough to remember, it's a moment they'll never forget. Within minutes, news of the president's death flashed across the country and around the world. America was in a state of shock. And among those hardest hit were members of the president's own Secret Service detail, especially those closest to him on that fateful day in Dallas.
When we got to Dallas, the airport was filled with people, exuberant about the president and Mrs. Kennedy arriving there. We had had a wonderful reception the day before for President and Mrs. Kennedy throughout Texas. We had no advance intelligence information that would indicate we were going to have a serious problem. He fed off the crowd. He loved to go into a crowd and shake hands. And so he didn't like the bubble top on the car.
Near the end of the motorcade route, the president's limousine made a fateful turn onto Elm Street in front of the Texas School Book Depository building.
I heard an explosive noise over my right shoulder from the rear. I wasn't sure that it was a rifle shot or a firecracker or what it was. I saw the president grab at his throat and he moved violently to his left because he had a back brace on and he couldn't move forward. So he moved left and he started to slump and his head kind of went tilted down. Just as I approached the car, there was a third shot and that hit the president in the head. And his head was tilted down and to the left so that the shot entered the rear of the head here and exploded and blew out the right rear portion of the head. I was just starting to get up on the car. Mrs. Kennedy then came up on the trunk of the car. She was trying to grab some of the material that came off the president's head from the explosive wound. I thought it must have been a fatal wound, but I didn't know for sure. The only thing Mrs. Kennedy said was, "Oh, Jack, what have they done?" And then she said, "Jack, I love you."
And we're back with VOA's Jim Malone. Jim, when we look back 50 years ago, from that day to today, how has that changed the country?
The assassination of President Kennedy really was a sort of shattering of national innocence. Up until that point, we had thought our presidents were kind of indestructible, even though we had some assassinated in the past. But Kennedy was so youthful, so vigorous, so emblematic of sort of a bright future. When he was struck down, there was kind of a national depression, quite frankly. And if you look what happened in the decade or so after Kennedy's death, the United States got enmeshed in the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia. There was also a great cynicism in the country that culminated more than 10 years later with the Watergate scandal that forced a president to resign. So the Kennedy assassination is kind of a landmark in American history, and it was a real turning point for the country.
Okay, and for the sake of our international audience, people have a lot of questions with regards to the conspiracy theories behind JFK's assassination. Is the case closed?
Case is never closed because even public opinion polls today show most Americans still doubt the official findings that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But on the flip side, there's never been a credible shred of evidence to suggest anything other than Oswald was the lone shooter that day. One misfit changed the course of the country and the world.
And when we talk about JFK, we can't ignore his family.
Yes.
How did they cope up with that? What happened to the family after the assassination?
Well, it's all part of the Kennedy myth, the myth of Camelot, that this magical time, a young family, that's unusual for an American president, 2 young children, a very glamorous wife who became well known around the world, places like India, Pakistan, as an ambassador at large for the Kennedy administration. She pretty much went into seclusion after that, was very concerned with her safety. But all these years later, Jackie Kennedy holds a special place in terms of first ladies in the United States and just all that she suffered through during the time of the assassination.
First ladies around the world, not just the United States. She inspired so many women around the world.
She did, and still does today. It was a magical time, people looking back, and they want that sense of hope and inspiration back, and that's why the Kennedy myth endures 50 years later. Most presidents, we don't react this way 50 years after they're gone. John F. Kennedy is a special case.
All right, and of course you can watch the entire documentary, JFK, A Legacy Remembered, at voanews.com. Thank you so much for joining us, Jim.
Thank you, Imran.